All right, everyone, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Annie Carter, and I'm the Education Programs Manager at Colorado Canyons Association. If you are not familiar with our work already, we do education outreach and stewardship of Colorado's 3 national conservation areas. All of those 3 are located on the West Slope, and we are based in Grand Junction, but work in Mesa, Delta, and Montrose counties to connect our local communities to those landscapes. We annually have a lecture series that's generally in this kind of shoulder season when we're not all outside enjoying the outdoors as much as we might be at other times of the year. And so tonight we're going to be learning about pollinator networks. It's especially relevant to some of our previous lecture topics. We had a lecture earlier this year, actually, about Gunnison sage grouse, their habitat, the restoration work. So this really ties in very nicely. Seth is joining us from Colorado State University, where he's an associate professor of forest entomology. And for everyone with us, please feel free to send questions in the Q&A and the chat. We will have about 10 minutes for questions at the end there. So feel free to type those in at any point during the lecture, and we'll have those answered at the end. With that, Seth, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Sure, and thanks very much for the invitation. So my audio is doing okay?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, happy to share our work with you, and I hope that you find it interesting and useful. So the title of the talk is Effects of Sagebrush Restoration Treatments on Pollination Networks in Colorado. And this was some work that was done in my lab group. And let me see if my slides will advance. It's been a little lagged out here. Okay. And I wanted to start by just giving credit to Koum Thapa-Magar, now Dr. Koum Thapa-Magar, who received his PhD while working on this project back in 2021. And the majority of the field work and initial data analysis and project management was done by Koum. And then, you know, after he moved on, he's now a postdoc at the University of Colorado. I picked it up and sort of helped to push it over the line. So I'm taking some of the credit, but really this was Koum's work, and I want to make sure that he gets credit for that. And I should also mention that this project was funded in cooperation with the BLM and some of their monitoring and management studies programs for NCA lands. So a brief overview of the talk today. I'll talk about pollinators a little bit and their decline, some of the issues facing pollinators, some basic information about the pollinators in Colorado, and then I'll talk about our study looking at the effects of sage grouse habitat management on pollinators in 2 national conservation areas in the Grand Junction area in Mesa County, and then just a little bit of information, if there's time, about some of the conclusions that we drew from the work, our next steps, and ongoing projects as we move forward. So there's many different pollinators across many different animal groups. So people most often think of insects as the primary pollinators, but hummingbirds, butterflies, bats, and then a whole variety of insects, in addition to bees, can serve as important pollinators in ecosystems. And pollination is essentially the glue that binds ecosystems together, terrestrial ecosystems, if you will, because their pollination and pollinators are responsible for the transfer of genetic material within and between plant populations. Now, up to 90% of plants rely on pollination by animals, and bees are the most important group in providing this ecosystem service. So people are right to have that bias. But most people are in general familiar with the European honeybee, which actually makes up for a very small proportion of pollination natural ecosystems. And this is something that's kind of becoming a theme in our work, is trying to disabuse people of the notion that that honeybees are the primary pollinator. Now, there has been plenty of work on honeybee decline and colony collapse, but that doesn't necessarily translate to the situation with native communities of wild bee pollinators, and I'll try to make that clear. So pollination is typically achieved by collection of pollen from flowers onto one of 2 pollen collection organs, if you will. The scopa, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not, but the scopa is essentially like a pollen brush that's on the abdomen of a lot of bees. And here, you can see some bees at work at the bottom right, collecting pollen onto the scopa, or the corbicula, which is the same type of pollen collection structure that European honeybees and many native bees also have, called pollen comb. And this is usually on one of the hind legs, and they'll collect pollen onto this. And then pollen is typically transferred between plants, either on a corbicular structure or a scopal structure. Most bees only have one of these two structures and not both. And now, the vast majority of bees in natural ecosystems are actually solitary. Again, many people think of the European honeybee as this eusocial insect that lives in large colonies and has a queen. But that's not really the case for actually the vast majority of native bees. Most of them, the great majority of them, are solitary. They live a solitary life cycle. The males are relatively short-lived and live long enough just to mate. And then typically the females will excavate either a burrow below ground if they're below ground nesting bees, or they'll find a cavity if they're an above ground cavity nesting bee, and just a nice narrow place to lay eggs that's protected from sunlight and the elements. And then typically the female will spend the rest of her life after mating collecting pollen, packing it into balls, packing these balls into either her cavity or her burrow, laying an egg on each one, and then closing them off with either soil or plant material. And she'll make as many cells as she can during her life in order to create the next generation. Larvae will develop into pupae typically over the winter, and then in the spring, when temperatures exceed about 60 Fahrenheit, they become active. They'll emerge from their pupal casing and then set off in search of mates and more pollen to provision burrows and nests. So this is sort of the general life cycle of the vast majority of bees in terrestrial ecosystems. And one interesting point to make is that in many cases, these native bees are actually better pollinators in terms of, if you were to think about it purely agronomically in terms of crop yields, than European honeybees, which actually are only okay pollinators. So here in this graph, you're looking at the visitation to crop flowers on the X and crop yield on the Y. You can see that honeybee only actually has some of the lower yields. Native bee assemblages tend to produce a higher crop yield than most honeybees. And then really in an ideal pollination services situation, you would have both of these for agronomic purposes to get the highest yields possible. But the point being that in many instances, these native bee communities are actually superior to honeybees in terms of providing pollination services. And so therefore their conservation is really a key consideration in ecosystem management, because not only are pollinators the glue that sort of binds ecosystems together, but they have a huge agronomic importance as well, and may even be superior to managed honeybees in many cases. So from a conservation perspective and an ecosystem services perspective, these native bee assemblages are really important for us to be thinking about when we undertake large projects, land management, and so on, that may have disproportionate effects on them. And we're seeing this in the news more and more, concerns over the decline of bumblebees, the concerns over decline of pollinators in Europe, and so on and so forth. So colony collapse disorder is an issue separate to the managed European honeybee. Insect decline in general and pollinator decline is a separate issue that relates to native bee assemblages. And we're starting to see this more and more in the popular media. And this idea of an insect apocalypse is something that's being represented more and more in the scientific literature. There's been evidence both for and against, but the key thing is that the loss of insect populations and the loss of pollinators specifically could really be catastrophic for food security and just for general integrity of ecosystems and ecosystem services. So here's a loss of bumblebees projected in the Western United States, set out to 2070 from a modeling paper. And these changes are likely going to have profound effects on ecosystems. And you can see that there's sort of winners and losers in this area, where the more northern systems may actually gain pollinator species richness as areas that were previously sort of inhospitable or too cold, warm, and then other areas in the contiguous lower 48 are going to see a mix of that. Us in Colorado, or we have a lot of alpine ecosystems, so we're going to see some areas where we may see warming and an improvement of the pollinator community. But then the story across most of the United States is that pollinators are in decline, and species richness could be lost from ecosystems rapidly. Here's another example looking at a couple of different climate change scenarios for a whole host of bumblebee species. And basically, you're looking at sort of the best and worst case climate change scenarios, the RCP 2.6 and the RCP 8.5. The realistic projections for our sort of climate change trajectory are somewhere in between these two. But almost the point being here that in almost all cases, the majority of species under either the worst or best case scenario, which we're very unlikely to achieve at this point, is decline. So generally the situation is not good, and we want to make sure that when we're implementing ecosystem management operations that we're having at least not negative effects on these pollinator communities. And of course, in terms of agronomic value and ecosystem value, I've sort of hinted to that already. Agricultural systems like fruit trees can yield values as high as $15,000 per hectare, which is quite a large amount, and most fruit trees require insect pollination. Global agriculture, we're looking at $170 billion dollars annually is the estimated cost or the estimated value of pollination services from natural pollinators. And of course, loss of these services can result in loss of livelihoods and agricultural productivity, challenges for global food security, food instability, and changes to ecosystems and ecological networks in unpredictable ways. So, point being, pollinator decline is a serious concern, and that's something that we're kind of trying to address with our research. And one of the interesting points to make from this slide, that what you're looking at here is a group of experts. Group of expert opinions were surveyed over a number of different land use and climate change threats across a number of different continents, across all continents that have important terrestrial ecosystems. And what you're looking at here is the way that a variety of biology experts rated those threats in terms of their importance, so being the most important or very important to not at all important, which is represented by dot size, and then their relative confidence in those interpretations from the existing literature, with like a black dot being something very well established and a light gray dot being kind of inconclusive or uncertain. The takeaway point of this slide from a paper that was published just a few years ago is that land cover configuration and land management are generally believed by experts to be very important, if not the most important factors globally affecting pollinator assemblages. And the literature shows that this is a well-established fact. So we hear about climate change, which they've rated as sort of established but incomplete, to other things like invasive species or GMOs being incomplete to inconclusive evidence for the effects of those on pollinators. But land management, land cover configuration are well-established, well-known factors affecting pollinators across all major continents, except for Africa, where we just simply don't have much research yet. So let's shift to Colorado and talk about sort of what the pollinator community looks like, the pollinator records look like across Colorado. Now, we have a history in this state of collection of pollinators since around 1850. The vast majority of those collections are represented in the Front Range region, Larimer, Boulder, Jefferson County, and El Paso County. Luckily, Mesa County also has pretty good records that date back to the 1850s. So this map is made from museum specimens. So certain areas in the state where there's been a population for a long time are very well represented. Much of the western slope is fairly well represented in terms of what we know about the pollinator communities that should be there and how that's changed over time. And then in the Eastern Plains and grasslands, museum records are far fewer. So we know very little about these areas and some of the more agriculturally important areas in the state in terms of what pollinators are actually there. So this is just kind of a snapshot of what we know from the state of Colorado already. So let's talk a little bit about bee biodiversity in Colorado. In terms of their diversity across the world, bees are a very species-rich group with almost 20,000 species worldwide. In Colorado, there's 946 known species, so approximately 600,000 total records, representing 5% of the known bee biodiversity in the world. So this is a very diverse place, actually, for bees, and it's probably because we have such a range of different ecosystem types, from sort of desert areas to grasslands and extensive rangelands to all kinds of different forest types spanning a wide range of elevations. So that landscape diversity, that land cover diversity is something that's really probably contributing to this high diversity of bees in Colorado. And I think this slide is a couple of years old. I think that number has actually changed and we're somewhere in the 950 range now, but still about 5% of the world's known bee biodiversity. And interestingly, when you look at patterns of bee biodiversity across the Western United States, in general, arid habitats tend to be associated with a more biodiverse community than wetter mesic habitats. It's not fully understood why that is, but for example, if you were to look in the Sonora Desert, or the Mojave Desert, you would find that the bee communities there are incredibly diverse as compared to some forest habitats. So arid habitats like the habitat in Mesa County and where our studies were done are pretty good habitats for pollinators. But the caveat is these areas are probably also more sensitive to degradation. So where we're having large ecosystem management operations in arid regions, it's probably important to monitor bee communities in those areas. So that being said, let's pivot to talking about the study at hand. So this is just a brief plug for CUM and our work, and the title of the article that the data are coming from is Effects of Sage Grouse Habitat Restoration Efforts on Pollination Networks in Arid Ecosystem. This is one of CUM's papers that I helped them co-write. So yeah, a little shameless self-promotion there. And the context for this study is that we wanted to monitor some of the habitat restoration efforts that the BLM was implementing for management of the greater sage grouse in general. So sage grouse, the greater sage grouse and the Gunnison sage grouse are listed as near threatened, and I think the Gunnison sage grouse is even listed as an endangered species. They're typically treated as threatened or imperiled. An iconic species, and removal of conifers is associated with increased nesting habitat for sage grouse. And here at these graphs you're looking at here is basically showing that as you remove conifers, over time you see a higher reproductive output of sage grouse, and then the further away they get from those areas where conifers were removed from the overstory, the nesting success goes down. So there's a pretty clear signal of vegetation management being associated with reproduction of the sage grouse. General idea being that you see encroachment of trees into sagebrush habitats over time, probably as a result of fire suppression policies for the last century. And in general, when you remove trees from these systems, you get recruitment of sage and more nesting success of greater sage grouse. Okay, so here's an example of what that might look like. I believe you're looking on the south side of maybe Dominguez, looking north here towards Grand Junction, and the Mesa Valley, and you can see you've got this sort of sagebrush system where fire has been suppressed for a very long time, and you're seeing encroachment of pinyon juniper trees into sage grouse nesting habitat. So when I say PJ, which is in the slides, what I'm referring to here is pinyon pine and one seed juniper primarily, PJ pinyon juniper. So the BLM has sought to attempt to restore some of these habitats in strategic locations to being primarily sagebrush through removal of the conifer overstory. And this is a fairly invasive practice because it can often involve mechanical removal of trees. Here, what you're looking at is a backhoe just coming in and essentially flattening them and scooping them up, which leaves a lot of woody material on the ground, which may be beneficial as nesting habitat, but it's unclear how these changes are likely to affect the pollinator communities in these areas. As you remove that canopy, you're changing the thermal conditions, increasing wind flow, increasing temperature at the ground surface, and so on. And it's just unclear whether that's good or bad for pollinators. One way that this is achieved is through use of a device called a roll chopper, or what they call a masticator. And so this will either be dragged behind a tractor, or it can be pushed in front of one of these big machines, and just totals everything in its path. These small trees are crushed to the ground, flattened, and splintered. And so again, that creates a lot of woody debris, which in some cases may be useful as nesting habitat for pollinators, and in other cases may actually preclude them from using like sandy soils if they're below ground burrowers. So in general, the BLM has these directives to improve habitat, and they want to recruit sage grouse into some of these habitats where they've been lost or extirpated from. They carry out these mastication treatments. I have mastication here because that's the type of treatment that we monitored, which reduces the canopy, results in recruitment of sage. And then we want to know, how do those vegetation management practices influence the other communities, the other sensitive communities that may be present there, and their interactions with plants, right? So we knew from a recent study, this was from a study that I carried out a couple of years ago near Westcliff, Colorado, which is also a sagebrush sort of dominated space in that Westcliff Valley. And we were trying to track, we weren't looking in that instance at ecosystem management practices, but just looking at variation in the canopy from areas that were very open canopies in this pinyon juniper sagebrush mixed habitat to areas that were very closed, relatively closed canopies. And what we found, as you're looking at these three graphs, you're looking at abundance at the top, the richness, that's the number of species in the community, and then the diversity of bees at two different times of the year. That's the gray and black dots. And in general, as the canopy becomes more open, we see a corresponding increase in abundance, richness, and diversity of bee assemblages in this particular habitat, right? But this was, again, just looking at a naturally occurring gradient of openness and not tracking specific treatments that had been implemented. So that was part of the goal of this project. But this was kind of an a priori expectation that there may be, in general, some benefits to the removal of the canopy by these masticators and these roll choppers. So the research questions that we tried to address were asking, what are the native bees that are present in the national conservation areas, the Western Colorado? So we specifically worked at McInnes Canyon and Dominguez Escalante National Conservation Areas. We wanted to know what were the effects of habitat conversion from juniper, pinyon juniper dominated to sagebrush dominated on plant pollinator networks. So not just the bee assemblages, but also their interactions with flowers. And then what were some of the most important species for supporting the pollination networks? In other words, if we were to go back to the BLM and say, here are species of high importance that we think you should include in seed mixes, that we would have something useful to tell them. And that maybe some species that are present, some floral species that are present in these systems are really good at supporting pollinators. And that was something we wanted to be able to make a recommendation about. So here's our study landscape. Over the course of 2 years, we tracked pollinator communities in 33 different locations. in the sort of southeastern corner of McKinnis Canyon and the western corner of Dominguez Escalante. And we chose sites that were both pinyon juniper dominated sites, sites that were dominated by sagebrush, and then sites that were pinyon juniper but had been converted using roll choppers to sagebrush. So three sort of different types of sites. And a brief point I'll make here is we also knew from some previous work that the way in which you sample the bee community has a large effect on the kind of conclusions that you can make. So the best practices will use multiple methods. Here I'm showing you something called a blue vein trap, that's A, bowl traps, which are B, and then hand netting, which is C. And as you can see from this Venn diagram, they each sort of have their own unique suite of species that they tend to capture. But if you can only choose one, you should choose netting because you get the most species overall. In this particular study, we just used blue vein traps and netting. And netting, this would account for about 82% of all biodiversity present in the system in terms of bees, as far as we understand. And netting has some real specific advantages because when you think of netting insects, I think most people think that like you see it flying by and you like net it from the air and you're really quick at just like sort of ninja netting things out of the air, but that's not actually how it really goes. Usually what happens is you see a bee already feeding on a flower and you're able to net it from that specific flower. And that has the advantage of telling you which bees came from which flowers. So here's a simplified version of an ecological network. In other words, we're able to track which bees are connected to which flowers and how common that is. And this provides the ability to analyze sort of the emergent properties of these networks, but also gives us direct information on which plant species are important for supporting which pollinators. That was kind of the approach that we took here. So there's a couple of different metrics, I guess, if you will, of these ecological networks, these plant pollinator networks that we measured. One, the first metric that I'll talk about is called nestedness, abbreviated weighted nestedness, W naught down there. But essentially a nested network is one like the one on the left of the screen that shows an overrepresentation of certain interactions. In other words, there are generalist pollinators that interact with everything. There are generalist plants that interact with all the pollinators. And then there are both specialist pollinators and plants that interact with generalists and specialists within those networks. In other words, there's a high functional redundancy in these systems, so that if you lose one of the pollinators or you lose one of the plants, the majority of the interactions would still be supported and the network wouldn't collapse. That's as opposed to a network structure which is more modular, where you may have groups of species that interact with each other intensely, but don't really interact with the other groups of interacting species. They may be connected by one or two links, but this essentially makes the ecosystem more vulnerable because if you lose one or two of these linkages or one or two of these modules, you lose a lot of the biodiversity in the system and there's no other species there to sort of replace that ecosystem function. So we were interested in this transition from nested to modular. We were also just interested in the overall linkage densities. The number of links in that system is very similarly associated with the resilience of the community to disturbance and change over time. Where if you have a lot of links, if you lose one or two because of species loss, extirpation, extinction, whatever, the network doesn't simply collapse because there's still lots of functional redundancy in that system. So we also analyzed the density of links within the network. And then we also analyzed something called specialization. So this is fairly self-evident in the sense that you may have lots of generalists or you may have lots of specialists within a network. And the more and more specialized a network becomes, the more likely it is that one or two losses of a species can result in the loss of a plant pollinator interaction and the loss of biodiversity from the system. So again, this is another type of functional redundancy that's sort of built in to these ecological networks. So those are the three things that we were interested in tracking. And we tracked them across sites that were that were PJ dominant, sites that have been treated here in the middle. So you're seeing sites that have been converted using the roll chopper to be predominantly open canopy, and then sites that were primarily sagebrush dominant. So the key thing to notice here is that in these treated sites, the kind of two pictures in the middle, you see a lot of woody material just left on the forest floor. And again, you saw what that looked like from the backhoe sort of driving over and flattening these things. And it's really undetermined whether or not this is an important resource for bees or whether this is a hindrance to them. So let's take a look at one of the first questions that we sought to answer, which was, what are the native bees that are present in NCAs in Western Colorado? And after 2 years of trapping, we were able to produce these beautiful pie charts. We trapped about 1,000 bees total. There were slightly more captured using nets in sagebrush than in the pinyon juniper habitat. So we found more bees in sagebrush habitat in general. And here you're looking at a bunch of different bee genera in these different pie charts. The key thing to note is that there was some transition in the overall community between these two different ecosystem types, where we tended to see a higher proportion of cavity nesting represented in the sagebrush sites. So that's the osmia and megachyle genera. We tended to see more below ground nesting represented in the PJ dominant sites, and that's shown by Andrena and Lasioglossum. So you can see those kind of 4 genera are changing in their overall representation between the two habitat types. Somewhat consistent with the idea that if you add woody material to the ground surface, you see more cavity nesters and fewer below ground nesters. So you get this trade-off in the functional diversity of the bees themselves. But overall, quite a few families and quite a few genera collected. So really a very biodiverse system overall in terms of basic bee occurrence. Here's a picture, a nice picture of what those two look like. So here your ground nesting bees are shown on the left, Lasioglossum, the sweat bees, Andrena, the mining bees. And on the right, megachyle, leafcutter bees, and osmia, mason bees. So these tend to be a little bit larger bodied. And most of these bees will have scopa. Most of them are solitary. There is some generalization here, like the megachyle and osmia are almost always solitary. The Lasioglossum are really variable. So within that genus, there may be species that are truly social or eusocial, and then some which are solitary, and so on for the Andrenids. So you see some variation within these genus level assignments in terms of the overall sociality of the species. So what are the effects of this habitat conversion on the plant pollinator networks in these systems? Well, here is the overall plant pollinator network compared between sagebrush sites and pinyon juniper sites. Okay, so on the left of each of these graphs are plant species, and on the right are bee species. And these are kind of mind-bending to look at, and I don't expect you to be able to make clear comparisons just from these raw pictures, but I wanted to give you an idea of the sort of complexity of the plant pollinator network in these habitats. They're extremely complex, and there's a lot going on. So being able to assign specific pollinators to specific plants is very useful. And you can see, for example, on the graph to the right, I think that will be, you're right, the pinyon juniper graph. Andrena represent a huge proportion of the bees that are present in that system, and they're interacting a lot with, like, serviceberry primarily, and then sort of few other things compared to that. But you also see real generalists like Andrena, and then you see real specialists as well. Like if you look at the bottom right of that graph, the Sphaustra, the sunflower bees, are only interacting with 1 or 2 other species. So you have a lot of functional redundancy nested within both of these systems. So what I'm going to show you now are the different metrics that were associated. We talked about nestedness, linkage density, specialization. So we'll talk about those three in succession. And what you're looking at here is our statistical comparison of nestedness in three different comparisons. So here we're comparing at the furthest left panel, sagebrush to pinyon juniper only. And you can see that there was a little bit higher nestedness in sagebrush habitats, but that difference wasn't statistically significant. By the way, the little red asterisk is going to denote statistical significance. In panel B, between the control and treated habitats, we saw a little bit higher nestedness in the control habitats, but there was a lot of overlap between those distributions. So even though that trended higher, the difference wasn't statistically significant. And then there was also just interannual variation, where in 1 year there was a lot more nested structure to the ecosystem than in the other year. And that probably had to do with just differences in precipitation and temperature between 2 years. So we could conclude that the vegetation removal practices and the habitats themselves weren't really that different in terms of their overall nestedness, which is a corollary to the resilience of those systems. Linkage density, however, was significantly higher in sagebrush dominated sites. So there were a lot more links. And this was also not affected really by the treatments, though you actually tended to see a higher linkage density in treated sites. This was not statistically significant, but also some differences between years. So you really have to be able to look across years in order to make reliable projections about these systems, which is one of the things we're learning more and more. Simple one summer study of the bee community and the bee flower interactions isn't very useful because you miss a lot of the variability that can occur. And then specialization was actually marginally increased from the removal of the vegetation. This difference was rather weak. So there's still a lot of overlap. But between the years and between the habitat types themselves, there's really no strong difference in overall specialization. So it's kind of hard to say whether the treatments benefited bees or harmed them. In terms of nestedness and linkage density, we don't really see any effects. And we see a slightly more specialized community, which may be slightly more vulnerable in some of these controlled, in some of these, giving you the wrong information. It's the control habitats that had higher specialization, meaning that those are actually slightly more likely to respond negatively to a changing system. So the treatments are good. Now, we were also able to take these metrics and compare them to a number of other things, like the aspect of the site. Is it a south slope or north slope? What was the elevation? What was the latitude? We can use those different variables to compute something called the heat load index, which just basically describes the amount of solar radiation that's hitting the ground surface. And then we were also able to look at other physiographic factors like the canopy cover within the habitat surrounding where we sampled. So not just at the place we sampled, but the overall larger picture of canopy. And then distance to roads, distance to the boundary of the NCA. So for example, where sites that were really interior in an NCA represented more biodiversity than sites that were really on the edge. And so we tried to model all these things in terms of their effects on just the abundance and richness of the bees that we sampled. So I'm going to just show you the statistical output and describe it to you. So we're looking here at abundance on the top and richness on the bottom. So number of bees, number of bee species. And we see the same pattern in both, for both metrics of the bee community. In general, as the heat load index increases, we see that having a negative effect, as shown by the negative coefficient in the estimate column, on the abundance and richness of bees. So hotter sites with a higher heat load index tend to not be great sites for bees. And then the coefficient is difficult to interpret in the distance to NCA edge, but this is actually a slightly negative effect, just not shown very well here. But essentially more interior sites had a lower abundance and richness of bees, which was unexpected. You would have expected those sort of more pristine areas that had been conserved and had less human impact to be overall better protected. and have a higher abundance and richness of bees, but that's not what we saw. What we actually saw was the opposite, and we think that's to do with weeds, with weedy plants. And so let me show you a little bit more of the story. But in other words, as you get closer to the edge of the NCA and in more and more rodent habitats, you see more and more weedy plants, which it turns out bees actually really like. So let's move on to this third question of what are the most important species for these pollination networks. Here you're looking at all of the plant taxa that we encountered, their families, and then genera grouped within families, and the number of interactions that they supported with bees in both the pinyon juniper, gray, and white being the sagebrush habitats. And so in these sagebrush habitats, we see things like Heterotheca, which is hairy aster, but like Cirsium also, thistles supporting a lot of interactions. And in the pinyon juniper habitats, it tended to be more woody plant species like Prunus, Amelanchier, serviceberry. Eriogonum was very abundant in the sagebrush habitats, and things like prickly pear. So these were kind of the big five or big six, seven here that supported the most interactions. And then just looking at the bees within those, so we saw in these pinyon juniper habitats or sagebrush habitats more megachyle and osmia, and then in the pinyon juniper habitats more andrena and lacy glossum, similar to what I said earlier. Apis is shown here. Very few honeybees were trapped in the study, which is good news, because that means people aren't illegally keeping bees on the NCAs. And also it means that there's just less competition from these managed honeybee colonies for our native bee communities. So it's a good thing. Now, when we go and just look, if we were to look at this graph and sort of separate it out carefully by the two habitat types, PJ and sagebrush habitat, what we can conclude is that the top 5 plant taxa that supported the most pollination interactions with wild bee pollinators and sagebrush sites were Heterotheca and Eriogonum, 2 native taxa, which is good, but then followed by Cirsium, invasive thistle, and Mellolotus sweet clover. I think Cirsium is listed as a class B noxious weed. So it's something that managers are trying hard to eradicate. And Mellolotus is everywhere and all over the roadsides in these habitats. So that might be why we saw actually a slightly less diverse community of bees as we move more and more interior, because you see less Cirsium and less Mellolotus. These tend to be concentrated by the roadside where there's lots of human activity. And then bitterweed, Tetranurus also supported a lot of interactions. So if I was going to recommend some seed mix for restoring these degraded sagebrush habitats, for example, I might suggest hairy aster, buckwheat, bitterweed. Now we saw a bit of a transition away from this in the pinyon juniper sites, where we saw serviceberry, prickly pear, milk vetch, and choke cherry supporting most of the interactions, which are all native species, so that's good. And then Mellolotus also being heavily present as a primary supporter of pollination networks in pinyon juniper sites. Another point, if you'll notice, you don't see a lot of Cirsium in these pinyon juniper sites, but you do see them in some of the sites that have been converted. So it's also well known that Cirsium and other thistles are often introduced following some of these restoration activities. So that's something to be aware of. So in terms of their overall sort of timing and phenology, Amelanchier, Astragalus, and Prunus tend to flower quite early, and that supported a lot of Andrena and Osmia. In the middle of the growing season, we see more cacti, prickly pear cacti, and then Mellolotus and Cirsium supporting interactions with Megachyle and Osmia. And then by late in the season, a lot of the interactions are supported by weeds. So early in the season, native plants appear to be very important, but then these weedy species are really important late season forage for bees. And so one of the things that we need to think about as we're communicating with the ecosystem managers about what these studies mean is that we need to think carefully about how weed eradication efforts may impact species of concern, like our native bee assemblages, which apparently really like some of these weedy species. So let's kind of bring it back, and try to conclude and wrap this up so we can do some questions. So for our first question, what are some of these native bees that are present? Well, we see a lot of cavity nesting bees and burrowing bees are abundant in the region. For general, we're very abundant. We detected very few native honeybees in these NCA areas. And of course, the bee assemblage that you encounter varies throughout the growing season, with highest biodiversity early in the season. The cavity nesting bees tend to be more present in the sites with more woody debris. And what we would also suggest from this information is that management activities should be limited during early in the growing season, so as to have the smallest effect on native plants and native bees and their interactions. Cavity nesters are likely to be affected by the removal of woody material. Ground nesters are likely to be impacted by soil compaction from heavy machinery. So early in the growing season, we really want to limit that soil compaction. What are the effects of the habitat conversion on the plant pollinator networks? Well, we didn't see a loss of interactions in sagebrush converted habitats, which is good. So it was more or less a null effect. The ecological networks differed, with more of a reliance on shrubs and shrubby flowering plants in PJ-dominated sites, and more of a reliance on flowering forbs and true flowers in sagebrush-dominated sites. We saw specialization and linkage density slightly higher in some of the sagebrush-dominated sites. And this conversion is associated with the improvement of metrics associated with network resilience, which is good. So what are some of the important species for supporting the pollination networks? Well, Heterotheca eriogonum, Tetranurus, and Grindelia are all really preferred native species by our native bee communities. And so we recommend that these be planted in your yard if you want to support native pollinators, and that the BLM incorporate these species into some of their restoration-based seed mixes. Shrubby taxa also can bloom really prolifically and can support many, many interactions. So things like prunus, chokecherry, and serviceberry are really nice if you can support these, because they produce many, many, many blooms. Whereas many of these other species, these flowering forbs, produce only a few blooms. So one plant, one tree can be a tremendous resource. Invasive species and weedy species are an important component of the network, particularly late in the growing season. And so we recommend to managers and to the BLM that they think carefully about how eradication efforts are going to impact the native bee community. There appears to be a relationship with roads. So roaded areas tend to have a higher abundance of these weedy species. And then, if we're going to remove some of these weedy species, let's try to replace them with species that are similar or have similar traits, because they're being used late in the growing season. So things that are corresponding to sort of a late season bloom period. By July in these areas, a lot of the pollinator activity is done for. So the majority of the activity is occurring in May and June. By July, it's really hot, and there's not a lot going on at that point. And most of the flowers have died or closed up, and most of the bees are done doing their thing by then. So what are we continuing forward with? This paper was recently published, of course, and now what we're moving on is to look at how some of the habitat restoration efforts in the Pine Gulch fire footprint are impacting native bee communities. So the BLM has aerial reseeded a lot of these areas, and we want to track to see basically whether we're able to detect the seed mixes that the BLM has distributed in burned habitats in the pollen of the bees. So we're using kind of a DNA metabarcoding forensics approach to try to determine, can we actually detect the pollen from the flowers that the BLM has tried to reseed with in the bees. And one way that we're doing this is by placing out these nests and then collecting the bees that inhabit these straws, and we can do all kinds of neat things like figure out whether they're bigger or they have more pollen provisions, or whether those pollen provisions have more nutrients and nitrogen, and they're reproducing more, where they're aerial seeded or not. So there's a lot of information we can pull from these studies. And I'll just give you a quick, we just got some data sort of fresh off the press. So a quick, interesting thing to show you, as it in the Pine Gulch fire footprint, particularly in this area of salt wash here, I drew a little box where most of the work is occurring. They are feeding heavily on Cercocarpus, Tetranurus, and Astragalus, so mostly native species, which is really good to see. We'll probably repeat this for another year and then have more to report out on in terms of how some of those reseeding efforts are affecting things. So we're close to time. If you have questions, you can just email me directly at seth.davis@coloradostate.edu. We'll be happy to share the paper, and I'll be happy to talk more with you about bees if you're interested.
Thank you so much, Seth. I loved seeing that chart of all the connections between the plants and the bees. That was really fascinating to see. If anyone has a question, please send it into the chat or the Q&A. We do have a few minutes until we need to wrap up. I guess while we're waiting for that, this is a partial question, partial sort of plug for something that we do. We have annually done a sage grouse habitat restoration project down in the Gunnison Gorge National Conservation Area. And for local folks, this is on the east side, down outside of Crawford, and it's a lop and scatter. So instead of doing big mechanical removal with machines, we actually have volunteers come out and just using hand tools, cutting down more sapling, pinyon, and juniper. And so I guess question for you, Seth, do you know anything about the effects that those types of restoration projects, or could you sort of hypothesize on how those might compare?
Yeah, my immediate guess is that lop and scatter hand felling approach would be a lot less impactful, because you're not going to see the same degree of soil compaction that you see with those wool choppers and that big heavy equipment. And you're probably not going to see the same level of invasive species accidental introductions. So I would say that's probably a better approach, especially if you can get the staff to do it. I know the reason that BLM tends to use some of these heavy duty methods is because they're trying to do so much work. And so you've got that trade-off at a certain point, but it would be my guess that you would see a reduced effect on less negative effect on the bee assemblages from the handwork.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, for anyone interested, we do that annually in September, right around National Public Lands Day, as a weekend event. So keep your eye out for that volunteer opportunity. We do have a question from Emily. She asks, did you get the chance to look at any interactions with herbicides the BLM may have been using on invasive plants?
Unfortunately, we did not. That wasn't what this particular project was geared around, but it's something we're very interested in. So one of the things we've been working on, we have some sort of high-tech analytical chemistry equipment in our lab, is whether we can grab a bee out of the environment and determine whether or not that individual has been exposed to pesticides or herbicides specifically. I mean, pesticides will just kill them, but herbicides are kind of nefarious because they may not seem like they're affecting them very much, but then they actually do much poorer over time. So you see a gradual decline in the community as a result. So we're working on it. In this study, no, I know they are heavily used for invasive, plant management, which is something I'm kind of like, I'm all for the removal of invasive species, but I've started to change some of my thinking about that when I see that, they're supporting a lot of the species of concern as well. So it's a challenging problem, one I'm not sure how we'll address. And I hope to be able to develop some of the tech to determine, what's the half-life of some of these herbicide exposures on bees and things like that. So coming.
Yeah. We'll give it another minute, see if other people have some thoughts or questions. I think, speaking anecdotally, you see bees and all sorts of insects just loving the sweet clover. They clearly have a strong preference for it.
Yes. And, from some other studies we've done, unfortunately, things like Cirsium are also highly nutritious in terms of their pollen protein content. So it's an interesting issue, and I don't know how we'll deal with it over time, but it's something that managers certainly need to be aware of.
Yeah. We do have another question for you. Recent, sorry, this is greater or Gunnison sage grouse. Pinyon juniper removal efforts have focused on the encroachment phase of pinyon juniper. What are your initial thoughts on different PJ age classes and the likelihood that they are occupied differently by pollinators? So old growth versus early encroachment.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when you see that early encroachment stage, the community there, and I mean, this is a bit of a guess, but I'm going to generalize based on the work we did in Westcliff as well, uh, is that it's kind of going to be similar. There's not a lot of change in the fundamentals of the system until you see that more old growth stage in which there is a rather different community of bees present there. So in terms of thinking about, bee conservation across the landscape, one type isn't better than another. Both types are supporting different types of communities, right? So I would sort of argue for a mosaic of old growth, more old growth stands and sagebrush stands. But yeah, that's just going to depend.
Yeah. One more question. Any bee use of knapweed? That's another one of those invasives that we have pretty prevalently out here.
Yeah, that's euphorbia, right? Is that
I
right?
can Google it.
Yeah, if that's you, so I don't I know most things by their scientific name, but I think it's euphorbia. Is that
I'm
right?
seeing Centauria.
Okay, yeah. So there are other types of, in this study, no. In
Okay.
other studies, yes. They love it. So yeah, again, bees love weeds, and I don't know, I don't know what we do about that, but it's yeah. So yes, they do like knapweed.
Yeah. We have a restoration project, actually in partnership with local schools with to eradicate Russian knapweed
Mhm.
along the river corridor, and it's just a nasty plant.
They are. One thing that's come up before is the question of whether or not bees are actually being supported by weeds at sort of a unnaturally high level. And so, are we seeing communities sort of reaching this abundance that they normally wouldn't have reached
Mm,
had those weeds not been there? If
yeah,
that pattern were true, then we wouldn't really feel so bad about eradicating these potential floral resources. If we're not able to support that, then I think there's going to be more, we're going to have to sort of think about which species really need to be eradicated and which don't.
yeah. Well, it looks like we have just about hit time. So thank you so much, Seth, for speaking to us tonight. I know I'm looking forward to hearing about that next project you're working on with the seeding after the fire and looking at what the bees are eating. That sounds fascinating. So
Yeah.
we'll be sure to send this information out to everyone. This lecture will be uploaded to YouTube tomorrow. And so everyone who is on here and who was registered for the event will be getting that in an email from me tomorrow. We also have another lecture next Tuesday at the same time, and that one will be about invasive bullfrogs and some local eradication efforts using citizen science. So if you aren't registered already, take a look on our website. We have a third lecture coming up when we're back after New Year's, and that one is January 9th. That'll be about Colorado River water policy. And if you are not connected with us already, take a look at our website. You can sign up for the newsletter. You can become a member. We have a whole host of resources and events available to the public and our members, including this lecture series. So thank you, Seth. Thank you for the work you're doing and for sharing it with us. And I hope
Yep.
everyone has a lovely night.
Thanks.
Okay.